let us learn about tropic movements. So, as you can see on the screen, it is the movement of the plant in response to the stimulus present in the environment. So, what do we mean by stimulus? Is anything from the external environment that triggers the plant in a positive or in a negative way. That is called as a stimulus. So, basically, stimulus is a trigger from the external world. It can be anything, and we'll get to know what I mean by stimulus in the other slides. So, how a plant responds to an external stimulus. For example, in human beings, when somebody is like throwing a stone at you, and you tend to react to it, like you either shoo away or you fight it out or something like that. Likewise, plants also have a tendency to react or respond to whatever changes that are happening in the external environment. So, those changes or those triggers are called as stimulus. That's what we are going to learn in this particular topic. So, the first type of tropic movement. So these movements, so this is nothing but the movements which help the plant to grow in a particular manner. But for each type of growth, the trigger will be different. That is what we are going to learn. So for, excuse me. So for the movement of a plant, we also call this as growth. So for a plant to grow in a particular direction or a particular manner, whatever triggers it from the external environment will be different. And the types are of 6 types. So we have phototropism, geotropism, thigmotropism, hydrotropism, and chemotropism. Let us learn them one by one. So phototropism, here the stimulus or the trigger from the external environment is sunlight. The very word photo stands for light or sunlight. So here the trigger that the plant is getting from outside is nothing but sunlight. So when sunlight falls on a plant, the plant will be able to respond in a particular manner towards that sunlight. For example, in this picture, you can see the sunlight is coming from the left. So the sunflower or any other plant for that matter will be blossoming towards the left side. In the mornings, the sun rises in the east. So the petals will blossom towards the eastern direction. So the growth of the stem or the growth of the shoot towards the sunlight is called as phototropism. So the trigger is sunlight, and the movement of the shoot towards the sunlight is called as phototropism. So as you can see, the shoot is moving towards the sunlight, but the roots will be moving away from the sunlight. So if I were to draw the roots, maybe I can draw it using green color since the pot is already in brown. So if I were to draw the roots will be moving in the opposite direction to the direction of sunlight. So since the shoot is moving towards the sunlight, it is called positive phototropism, because the stem needs sunlight for the purpose of photosynthesis, and the roots will be going away from the sunlight. So it's called as negative phototropism. So the roots follow something called as positive phototropism. The shoots follow something called as positive phototropism, I'm sorry. And also the roots follow something called as negative phototropism, which means they will be going opposite to the direction of sunlight. So this is something that we need to know with respect to phototropism. So to summarize this, the trigger is sunlight, and the shoots will move towards the sunlight and roots will move away from the sunlight or in the opposite direction. So like this, we also have one more thing called geotropism. So geotropism, the very word geo stands for earth or soil. So we know that the roots will move towards the soil, as you can see here. So the roots are moving towards the soil. So that is called as positive geotropism, or towards the earth. And in any manner, if you place a potted plant, like if you place it like in a slanting manner or in a horizontal manner also, the roots will be going towards the soil, and the shoot will grow away from the soil, as you can see here. It will always grow towards the sunlight. So this process called as geotropism. Roots follow positive geotropism and shoots follow negative geotropism because they are moving away from the earth. Or in other words, we can also say positive geotropism is nothing but negative phototropism, and negative geotropism is nothing but positive phototropism. And here the trigger is gravity or earth. So geo stands for gravity or earth. So roots are moving towards the gravity, and shoot is moving away from the gravity. The next type of tropic movement is called thigmotropism. Here thigmo stands for touch. So we have learned this in thigmoreceptors in the types of receptors. So thigmo means a stimulus of touch. When the external stimulus is touch or support, then the plant will behave in a particular manner or it will grow in a particular manner. That is called as thigmotropism. And now, for example, if you consider plants which are in the form of creepers, like pumpkin or some melons. So what happens is the creepers will have tendrils, as you can see. Sometimes the tendrils are so soft and slender, they need a support to grow. So we have all seen grapevines and all of that, how it's grown. So there are sticks that are provided by the farmer to support the plant. So as the plant keeps growing, there are tendrils which kind of encircle, also to an extent money plant and all of that, which we have seen in our neighborhood. So they will be able to encircle around the support and they will be able to grow. So whenever they come in contact with the stimulus of touch, so there is a tendril, and whenever there is a stick or something which is in contact, so once the tendril touches it, automatically the auxin in the tendril will tend to grow and will encircle and have a very good support when it grows. So this is also something that we need to understand, and this is called thigmotropism. Now, the next type of tropism after this is called hydrotropism. Here the stimulus is water. In the previous one, the stimulus was touch or support, any supporting stick. Here, the stimulus is water. For example, the root always grows towards water. So you can see in the second picture, in the picture in the right hand side, that there is some water source, and you can very clearly see the what. I'm sorry, just a minute. And you can very clearly see the roots are moving towards that water. If you look at this, the roots are moving towards that water source, an underground water or something, groundwater, the roots are moving towards it. So if you have a plant, the roots will always move towards the direction where there is a lot of water, and this is called hydrotropism, and here the external stimulus is water. And this is also one of the important examples of tropic movements. Now let's learn about chemotropism. Here the stimulus is chemical stimulus. So what we mean by chemical can be anything like an enzyme or a pollen grain or whatever. So for example, in plants, the chemical that we're talking about is pollen grain. We'll be learning about this particular tropic movement in detail in the chapter called reproduction. That is, how do organisms reproduce, the next chapter. So basically what happens is there are two types of flowers, unisexual and bisexual flowers, which we'll be learning in the next chapter. But the plants will be able to reproduce, and the very first stage of reproduction, sexual reproduction in plants, is pollination. So what happens in pollination is the pollen grains, which look like yellow, small yellow grains, they will be traveling from one plant to another or within the same plant also. So these pollen grains are like the very first stages for the sexual reproduction to happen. So these pollen grains will be transferred from the male part of a flower to the female part of the same flower or a different flower. But it should be of the same species. Now, these pollen grains are produced by the male part of the flower. Now, this has to be sent to the female part of the flower. So as you all can see on the screen, all these are the male parts of the flower. So these are called the stamen, which consists of anther and filament. So these parts as a whole, they are called as stamen, and this yellow part is called as the anther, and the stem which is holding on to this anther is called as the filament. So anther has a lot of small yellow color grains called pollen grains, and these pollen grains are like sperms in human beings. So now these pollen grains have to reach the female part. The female part is the middle part, and it has to reach this circular section or oval shaped portion called the ovary. That is the very idea. So only if this happens, the plant will produce seeds in the next generation and all of that. So this process called as pollination, where the pollen grains from the male part have to reach the female part. Now this is facilitated by various things like pollinating agents, like it can be wind or water or insects or animals. So these pollen grains will reach here somehow, especially through wind. So they will reach the top of the female part. The central one is the female part. Now this pollen grain has to reach the ovary. So what happens is, as soon as the male part reaches this portion, as soon as the male part reaches the female part, the pollen grain reaches the female part, this will send a chemical signal to the ovary to send a tube to receive this pollen grain. So the growth of that tube is called as chemotropism. I repeat, when it comes to a flower, it can have male and female parts. The male part will produce something called as pollen grains. The idea of this pollen grain is to reach the female flower in order to fertilize and produce the next generation. Now, the pollen grain can only reach the top of the female part using pollinating agents like insects or wind. But for it to reach the ovary is the trouble. So, as soon as this pollen grain reaches the top of the female part, there is a chemical signal that is sent to the ovary, due to which the ovary starts to grow a pipe or a tube, which goes to the top of the female part to receive this pollen grain onto the ovule, into the ovule. So, that process is called as Thigmotropism. Because the pollen tube, this tube which is growing towards the top to receive the pollen grain, that growth of that tube is called as Thigmotropism. So this is something we'll be learning in detail in the next chapter. So the next one is called Thermotropism. The very name suggests thermo means temperature. So the movement of a plant based on changes in temperature in the environment, that is called as Thermotropism. For example, if you look at the picture, during a hot temperature, a plant is like the leaves are all wide and spread out, and during a cold temperature, they kind of drool and they are like looks like they are sad, something like that. That is called as Thermotropism. So why this happens is something that we need to delve into deep. And let me give you an example for this. As you can see, Thermotropism happens in a plant called rhododendron plant. It's grown mainly, you can see this in Nepal and Sikkim, mainly in Himalayan regions, there are lots of rhododendron plants. So you can see the leaves are all kind of, they're all like drooling, and they are not actively wide and spread out. They are like kind of very narrow and all that. So now this is during a cold temperature. During a warm temperature, when the sunlight is there, when there is not much of snow and all that, they will spread out. You can see patches of snow here. You can see snow here, wherever I'm encircling, you can see snow. So because it's a very cold temperature, it kind of drools in. And also when there is a warm temperature, they will spread out and all that. And why this happens is something that we need to learn in higher grades. And one of the reasons is attributed to calcium ion concentration, something like that. So that is about Thermotropism. Now let us also learn about a different type of movement called Nastic movement, as you can see on the screen. So before getting into Nastic movement, let us summarize what is Tropic movement. So as I told you, Tropic movement is the movement of the plant or the growth of the plant. So there is growth involved in Tropic movements in response to external stimuli. The stimuli can vary. If it is sunlight, it is phototropism and shoots follow this. If it is gravity, it is geotropism and roots follow this. If it is touch or support, it is thigmotropism and tendrils follow this, especially in climbers. And if it is water, the trigger is water, then it is hydrotropism, roots follow this. If it is a chemical stimulus, then it is chemotropism, and pollen tube follows this. And if it is change in temperature in the external surrounding, it's called thermotropism. And plants like rhododendron follow this, and leaves follow this especially. And now there is another different type of movement called Nastic movement. So Nastic movement doesn't contribute towards the growth. If you look at the first point, it will be clear. This is a tabular column of difference between Nastic and Tropic movement. So Nastic movement, it's very obvious that it's a growth independent movement, which means it doesn't contribute towards the growth. Whereas Tropic movement is a growth dependent movement. That is what we have been seeing till now. All the types of movement till now, they have contributed towards the growth. Even Thermotropism, there was some growth when it was warm. It was like growing like something like that. So this is the difference between the basic simple definition difference between Nastic and Tropic movement. Before we get into the other differences, let us look at what an example for Nastic movement. An example for Nastic movement is mimosa plant. It's also called as chui mui, and scientifically. So we have all seen this at some point in our lives. So there is a plant, when we touch it, the leaves will actually shrink, and when we leave it, the leaves will actually widen and come back to the original shape. So here, when we touch it, it shrinks, and when we leave it, it comes back to the same shape. It doesn't grow longer. So that is why we call this as Nastic movement, because there is no growth in this. So it's a completely growth independent movement. When I say growth independent, I mean these type of movements do not contribute towards the growth. Now let us get back to the difference. I hope the first point is clear. The second point is time of action. Nastic movement is very immediate, which means when you touch a mimosa plant, immediately it shrinks. And when you leave it, immediately it widens. But tropic movement will take some time. All the type of tropic movements that we have seen, all the 6 types, it will take some time. For example, when there is a sun in the morning, the sunflower doesn't immediately go towards the sun in fraction of seconds or seconds for that time. It takes some minutes to actually grow towards the sunlight, or it takes some minutes for the water, for the roots to grow towards the water when it comes to hydrotropism. So it is slow. Third one, response to stimulus. It is non-directional. Nastic is non-directional because it is independent of direction. It happens in whichever direction we touch based on the stimulus. But tropic movement is completely directional, whether it is towards sunlight, away from sunlight, towards root, away from root, and all that. Fourth one, why this happens. This is a very important point. Reason for action means why this is happening or how this is happening. So as you all know, tropic movement is happening because of cell division. For example, if a shoot is growing towards sunlight, it is because oxygen is stimulating that growth and there is cell division happening. That's why it is able to grow. But in nastic movement, it's because of change in turgor. What is meant by turgor is the amount of fluid that is present in a cell. That's called as turgor. For example, when it comes to mimosa plant, so you are touching the leaves of the mimosa plant. So when you touch the leaves of the mimosa plant, what happens? The water that is present in the cells will go out of the cell. It's like osmosis. So now what happens? The cells will shrink. So automatically the leaves will also shrink. Now when you leave it, the water that is outside the cell will again come into the cell. So it will bulge, it will expand. So the reason for this nastic movement is movement of water into and out of the cell. When water is inside the cell, it exerts a lot of pressure on the cell wall. Imagine there is a plant cell and there is a lot of water inside. So it exerts a lot of pressure on the cell membrane, which in turn exerts a lot of pressure on the cell wall, because of which it swells and appears as if it's white. But when you touch a mimosa plant, the water is lost and there is no turgor. It's also called as turgidity, and it will shrink and it will give rise to this shape which is like shrink. Now, the next point is alternate name. It's also called as nastics and it's also called as tropism. And examples is for nastic is, as we just saw, mimosa plant and also opening and closing of stomata. The movement of stomata is also nastic movement. That's very important. So because the opening and closing of stomata is controlled by guard cells, but how? Again by water. If water gets into the guard cells, it swells and the stomatal pore is open. And if water is lost, it shrinks and the stomatal pore closes. All this we have learnt in life processes. And so this is something that we need to understand. And also when it comes to tropic movement, the types examples are phototropism, geotropism, hydrotropism, chemotropism, also other two tropism, thigmo and thermo as well. So with this, we come to the end of this nastic and tropic movements. And I would like to finish it with one more idea. So we understand how this movement is happening in plants. But how is the movement happening in animals or human beings? That we need to understand. So for example, if you are removing your muscles, okay, there is a contraction relaxation of muscle cells. In plants, the contraction relaxation is because of movement of water. In human beings and animals, the contraction relaxation, for example, if there is a muscle cell, there is a movement like this. If you imagine this as smooth muscles, there is a movement like this. There is a sliding of muscle cells. Now, sometimes the muscle cells will contract, sometimes they will relax. So what contributes towards this contraction relaxation of muscle cells? Similar to plants, wherein this is because of water. In humans and animals, it's because of the movement of proteins. So when proteins are moving inside the cells, it becomes a bit rigid. The muscle becomes a bit rigid and strong. And when you just relax your muscles, the proteins go out of the cell. So it's because of a type of protein called contractile proteins, which actually change their shape. It's not exactly getting into the cell or getting out of the cell like what it happens in plants, but it's also because of at a particular type of protein called contractile proteins, which can change their shape based on your movement of the body muscles. So with this, we come to the end of this chapter.